Most people believe if you want to feed your family, you plant fruit trees, an apple tree, a peach tree, maybe an orange, and then you wait years just to get your first real harvest. But what if the most productive food plants weren't trees at all? What if they were small, overlooked bushes, capable of producing more nutrition, more food, and more reliability without the wait? For generations, families depended on these bushes to survive hard times. But today, almost nobody plants them. Not because they stopped producing, but because people forgot what they're capable of. In this video, you'll discover 20 tiny bushes that can feed a family better than fruit trees. And number 9 produces so much food, one plant can harvest for decades. Fruit trees get the attention. They're big, impressive, permanent, but they come with a cost most people don't talk about. They take years to mature, they fail in late frosts, and when drought hits, they suffer first. But the families who truly understood survival didn't rely only on trees, they planted bushes. Smaller, faster, hardier, bushes that produced sooner, survived longer, and quietly fed entire households while others were still waiting for their first apple. The first one was so reliable, it became a staple in American backyard gardens. Number 1, blueberry. The bush that produces for generations. A single blueberry bush can produce food for over 30 years. Not once, every single season. Families planted them because they didn't just provide fruit, they provided security. Blueberries survived cold winters, poor soil, unpredictable weather, and today they're known as one of the most nutrient-dense foods you can grow. But while blueberries became commercial crops, most families stopped planting them at home. Not because they couldn't, because they assumed they needed trees instead. But blueberries were only the beginning, because the next bush produces faster than almost anything else. Number 2, raspberry, the fastest producer. Raspberries don't make you wait. Some varieties produce fruit in their very first year. Families valued them because they multiplied quickly. One plant became many, and each one produced more food. They required little space, little effort, but modern yards replaced food with grass, and raspberries disappeared from home landscapes. Even though they never stopped growing, but speed wasn't the only advantage. The next bush survived conditions that killed fruit trees. Number 3, currant. The forgotten survivor. Currants were once everywhere. American families relied on them because they survived cold climates where fruit trees failed. They produced heavily, reliably. But currants were restricted in the early 1900s due to agricultural concerns. And over time, families stopped planting them, not because they weren't productive, because access disappeared. Yet currants remain one of the most efficient food bushes you can grow, but survival wasn't their only strength. The next bush thrived in heat. Number 4, blackberry, the bush that thrives anywhere. Blackberries didn't need perfect soil, they didn't need protection. They grew wild, strong, independent. Families harvested them every year without planting new ones. They returned on their own, providing food without permission. But modern landscaping labeled them invasive, and people began removing them, even though they had fed families for generations. But independence wasn't their only gift. The next bush produced when others couldn't. Number 5, gooseberry, the heavy producer. Gooseberries produced heavily, more than most fruit trees their size. Families trusted them because they filled pantries quickly. But gooseberries lost popularity as grocery stores expanded. People stopped growing what they could buy, and slowly gooseberries disappeared from backyards, even though they never lost their productivity. But production alone wasn't enough. The next bush offered something even more important: reliability. Number 6, elderberry, the survival bush. Elderberries grew when nothing else did. They tolerated poor soil, harsh weather, neglect. Families planted them because they didn't fail, and they produced year after year. But elderberries became associated with wild growth, not intentional planting, so people stopped cultivating them. Even though they never stopped producing, but elderberry wasn't the longest producer. The next bush could outlive its owner. Number 7, serviceberry, the multi-generational bush. Serviceberries lived for decades, sometimes longer. Families planted them knowing future generations would harvest from the same plant. They required little maintenance. But commercial agriculture ignored them, and home growers followed, choosing store-bought fruit instead. Even though serviceberries never stopped producing, but longevity wasn't their only advantage. The next bush produced massive harvests in small spaces. Number 8, aronia, the high-yield bush. Aronia bushes produced heavily, more than most plants their size. Families valued them because they provided abundance without needing space. But aronia never became mainstream, not because it lacked value, because it lacked marketing. Yet it remains one of the highest yield bushes available, but even aronia couldn't match the productivity of the next plant. Number 9. Mulberry bush form, the endless producer. Most people think of mulberries as trees, but bush varieties exist, and they produce constantly. Families harvested mulberries season after season, without replanting, without effort, but mulberries fell out of favor in modern yards, even though their productivity never changed. But constant production wasn't their only strength. The next bush offered total reliability. Number 10. Honeyberry. The early provider. Honeyberries produced earlier than almost anything else, before most fruit trees even flowered. Families relied on them because they provided food first, when food was scarce. But modern growers focused on commercial crops. Honeyberries remained unknown, even though they still produced, right on schedule. Number 11. Sea buckthorn. The nutrient giant sea buckthorn doesn't just produce fruit, it produces survival. Small orange berries grow in massive clusters, covering the branches so heavily they can bend them down. Families who planted sea buckthorn didn't worry about poor soil. It thrived where fruit trees struggled. It survived drought, wind, neglect, and every year it came back loaded with food. But commercial farming ignored it, not because it was weak, because it was too unfamiliar. Yet one bush could feed a family longer than most trees ever could. But even sea buckthorn wasn't the easiest bush to grow. The next one practically grew itself. Number 12. Hazelnut bush. The protein source. Most people don't realize hazelnuts grow on bushes too, not just trees. And for American homesteaders, hazelnuts meant something fruit never could. Protein, real, lasting nutrition. They stored for months, sometimes years. Families planted hazelnuts because they didn't just feed you today. They fed you through winter, but modern families stopped planting them, not because they stopped producing, because grocery stores replaced self-reliance. But hazelnuts weren't the only long-term food source. The next bush fed families during the hardest times in American history. Number 13. Juneberry, the Depression survivor. During the Great Depression, families turned to juneberries because they had no choice. These bushes produced dependable harvests when money was scarce and food was uncertain. They didn't need perfect care. They simply grew, quietly feeding families when nothing else could. But when prosperity returned, juneberries were left behind. Not because they failed, because people no longer needed them to survive, but survival wasn't the only advantage. The next bush produced food for nearly half a century. Number 14. Lingonberry. The cold climate provider. Lingonberries thrived in cold climates, places fruit trees couldn't survive. Families in northern regions depended on them. Year after year, they didn't freeze out, they didn't fail, they endured, but modern agriculture focused on easier commercial crops. Lingonberries became rare in home gardens, even though their strength never changed, but strength wasn't their only advantage. The next bush fed families without needing replanting. Number 15. Goumi. The self-sufficient bush. Goumi bushes didn't need help. They improved the soil they grew in, they produced heavily, and they returned every year. Families valued them because they asked for nothing and gave everything. Modern growers ignored them because they weren't part of commercial farming. Still, Goumi never stopped producing, waiting for someone to plant it again, but productivity wasn't their only gift. The next bush offered something modern crops couldn't: freedom. Number 16. Autumn olive, the abundant provider. Autumn olive bushes produced massive harvests. So much food, families struggled to use it all. They thrived in poor soil and grew fast, too fast. They were labeled invasive, and people began removing them, not because they couldn't feed families, but because they grew without permission. Still, their productivity never stopped. But even autumn olive wasn't the most overlooked survival bush. The next one grew where nothing else would. Number 17. Rugosa rose, the hidden food source. Most people see roses as decoration, but rugosa rose produced edible fruit called rose hips. And they produced heavily. Families harvested them for food and storage, but modern landscaping focused on appearance, not survival, so their purpose was forgotten, even though they never stopped growing. But even roses weren't the most reliable. The next bush provided food when families needed it most. Number 18. Highbush cranberry. The winter provider. Highbush cranberries stayed on the plant long after summer ended, providing food when nothing else remained. Families relied on them during winter months, when survival mattered most. But modern food systems replaced seasonal dependence, and highbush cranberry disappeared from home planting. Even though it still produces, every year, but winter survival wasn't their only advantage. The next bush provided security for decades. Number 19, American Persimmon Bush Form, the long-term investment bush form persimmons produced for generations. Families planted them knowing their children would harvest from the same plant. They required patience, but rewarded it. Modern families stopped planting for the future. They planted for convenience, and persimmons slowly disappeared, even though they never stopped growing. And that brings us to the final bush, the one most people walk past without ever realizing its value. Number 20, Wild Blackberry, the bush that never needed permission. Wild blackberries didn't wait to be planted. They appeared along fences, fields, roads. They fed families without being asked, without being maintained, without being owned. But modern society labeled them weeds and removed them. Even though they had fed families for centuries. Final ending, emotional survival message. Not long ago, families didn't depend on systems. They depended on plants, small bushes, quiet providers, reliable food sources that returned every year. They didn't need perfect conditions. They didn't need protection. They simply grew and fed whoever paid attention. But over time, lawns replaced food, convenience replaced self-reliance, and the bushes that once fed entire families were forgotten. Not because they stopped producing, but because people stopped planting them. Yet even now, they're still here, waiting, proof that sometimes the plants that feed you best are the ones nobody talks about.